When you go no contact, a narcissist doesn't just notice it. They feel it like a sudden oxygen cut. It hits them instantly, violently, and personally, and what happens next isn't logical. It's psychological warfare inside their mind. Stay with me, because I'll walk you through exactly what they think day by day, and why it reveals everything about their fractured self. If you want to understand narcissists on a level that puts your power back into your hands, make sure you stay until the end, because the final stage is the one they never want you to understand. The first stage begins with a kind of psychological whiplash for the narcissist, because your silence is interpreted as an attack rather than a boundary. They experience it as a rupture in the predictable flow of attention they've come to depend on. Even if they acted bored, detached, or indifferent toward you, they always expected that you would remain accessible, responsive, and emotionally available. So when you suddenly go no contact, it strikes them at the core of their entitlement. Their mind scrambles for an explanation that shields their fragile ego from the idea that someone chose to step away from them. The shock blends with irritation, and irritation quickly mutates into anger. They tell themselves they didn't need you, but they are simultaneously unsettled because they can no longer reach you to restore the dynamic they controlled. This anger isn't just emotional, it's strategic. They start interrogating the last interactions, looking for clues about what they missed or where the shift happened. They examine your silence as if it's a puzzle, trying to determine if it's temporary, accidental, or intentional. But beneath their analysis is the creeping fear that they've lost a source of validation they assumed would always be there. Your absence disrupts their sense of superiority, so their mind works overtime to reframe the situation in a way that maintains their dominance. They may convince themselves you're being childish or dramatic, because that narrative lets them stay emotionally unaccountable. Yet, even in this early stage, your silence feels like a threat to their identity. Narcissists rely heavily on external input to stabilize the internal void they live with, and when you withdraw, that access point is severed. The reaction is immediate because it touches the parts of themselves they avoid confronting. Without the power to provoke, charm, manipulate, or guilt you, they feel a loss of influence. They aren't equipped to manage. They won't acknowledge this vulnerability. So, the initial shock is wrapped in arrogance, but it doesn't change the reality underneath. You pulled a lever they can't unpull, and even in their denial, they can feel the shift. The second stage begins when the narcissist realizes your silence isn't a momentary glitch, but a pattern, and their mind shifts into a frantic search for control. They don't look inward to understand what led to your withdrawal. Instead, they scan everything outside themselves to locate the error in the system. They begin replaying conversations, behaviors, and situations, not to gain insight, but to identify where they lost their grip. This isn't reflection, it's troubleshooting. They view relationships like tools, and when a tool stops functioning, the instinct is to figure out how to get it working again without ever questioning their own actions. During this phase, they start constructing explanations that place them in a position of power. They might think you're overthinking, being emotional, or acting impulsively because these interpretations make your silence feel less threatening. They rely on these narratives to protect their ego from the possibility that you acted out of strength or clarity. What unsettles them is the unpredictability. You stepping away voluntarily contradicts their belief that they are the gravitational center of every relationship they're in. This is also when they begin testing the edges of your silence. They might check your social media, ask mutual contacts about you, or subtly monitor your activity. They are looking for any sign that you still feel their presence, because that would confirm they haven't lost control. Even if they don't reach out directly, they start strategizing how they might draw you back in if they need to. It becomes a mental chess game where they try to anticipate your next move, all while pretending to themselves that they don't care. Inside their mind, a quiet panic grows. The withdrawal of attention feels like an attack on their status, and they start imagining scenarios where you've shifted your loyalty, energy, or emotions elsewhere. They can't tolerate the idea of being deprioritized. So, they create stories where you're temporarily confused or emotionally reacting, because that keeps them buffered from the truth. They search for their lost control, not because they want connection, but because losing influence feels like losing identity. In this stage, your silence becomes the one thing they can't manipulate, and that is the first real crack in the illusion they built around themselves. The third stage begins when the narcissist realizes that your silence is not only consistent, but emotionally detached, and this threatens them in a deeper way. To protect themselves from that threat, they start crafting narratives that make your separation feel smaller, less meaningful, and less intentional than it actually is. These narratives are not built on truth. They are built on self-preservation. A narcissist cannot allow themselves to believe that you left because of their behavior, their neglect, or their cruelty. That would require accountability, and accountability would crack the fragile shell they use to protect their ego. So instead, they begin rewriting the story in a way that keeps them blameless and superior. They create these stories in their mind almost like emotional shields. They may think you're being overly sensitive, that you misunderstood them, or that you're acting impulsively. They might tell themselves you're just trying to get attention, or that you want them to chase you. These narratives help them maintain the illusion that they are the one in control. Even though the reality is that they feel destabilized by your absence, the story they create becomes their emotional armor, because acknowledging that you left with clarity and purpose would strike at the core of their inflated identity. This stage also marks the beginning of emotional minimization. They downplay what you meant to them not because you were insignificant, but because admitting your importance would highlight the loss they now feel. They make you smaller in their mind to make the pain and insecurity feel smaller, too. It's a psychological trick they use on themselves to avoid discomfort. They might even convince themselves that you're going to return once you calm down, because believing that keeps them safe from the idea that someone walked away without needing their permission. Meanwhile, underneath these rationalizations, there is a growing discomfort. They won't name a quiet awareness that your withdrawal has meaning, that the story they're telling themselves doesn't fully fit. But instead of confronting that possibility, they layer on more justifications and more ego-protecting explanations. Your silence becomes something they have to explain away, and the narrative becomes the place where they hide from the truth they're not ready to face. The fourth stage begins when the narcissist realizes they no longer have access to your reactions. And this triggers an obsessive kind of monitoring in their mind. They're not simply wondering where you are. They're wondering whether you are still thinking about them, still hurting, still confused, still affected. Their focus turns inward and outward at the same time, scanning for signs that they still occupy space in your emotional world. This obsession isn't rooted in affection or care. It's rooted in dependency. They need to believe they still matter because their sense of identity has always relied on how strongly others respond to them. In this phase, they may start checking your online presence far more than they ever checked on you when you were around. They look for clues, story views, posts, subtle messages that indicate you haven't fully detached. Even your absence online becomes something they interpret or overthink. They want evidence that their influence lingers because that would reassure them, that you're still orbiting them even if you're silent. And if they can't find evidence, they start filling the gaps with assumptions. They may imagine you're quietly suffering, missing them, or waiting for them to make the first move. These fantasies help them maintain a sense of control, even if that control exists only in their mind. Privately, they also begin testing their own significance. They may post things designed to provoke a reaction, pictures, quotes, sudden displays of happiness, or hints of moving on. Every move they make is a hook disguised as self-expression. They're not trying to live. They're trying to lure you back into viewing their life. What unsettles them most is not your silence. It's the possibility that your silence means liberation. So, they cling to the idea that you're still watching, still waiting, still emotionally entangled. This stage exposes something they rarely admit. They fear invisibility. They fear irrelevance. The idea that someone they once controlled can detach so deeply becomes a threat to their self-image. So they monitor, they imagine, they strategize, all to confirm that they still hold space in your mind. But the more time passes without proof, the more the internal tension grows. Their obsession becomes a reflection of the power they hoped they still had, and the uncomfortable realization that they might be losing it. The fifth stage unfolds when the narcissist begins to feel the emotional consequences of losing your attention. And this is where their internal world becomes chaotic. They start cycling between two intense emotional states, rage and longing. These swings aren't about love or grief in any healthy sense. They are about withdrawal. You were a source of emotional supply, validation, admiration, reaction, presence, and now that supply is gone. So their mind ricochets between anger at losing control and a desperate craving to feel relevant again. This back and forth creates a kind of emotional turbulence that they try to hide from everyone, including themselves. In one moment, they might feel enraged and think they never needed you, convincing themselves they're better off without you and that you were the problem. This burst of anger gives them temporary relief because it allows them to feel powerful, but that feeling doesn't last. As soon as the anger cools, the emptiness resurfaces and the longing takes over. Not longing for you as a person, but longing for what you provided. They miss the attention, the emotional access, the predictable responses they could pull from you with a single message or gesture. They miss the comfort of knowing someone was emotionally tied to them in a way that stabilized their ego. This longing, however, comes with humiliation because craving the attention of someone who walked away contradicts their sense of superiority. So they swing back to anger, anger at you for leaving, anger at themselves for caring, anger at the situation for slipping out of their control. These emotional shifts become a cycle, rage to reaffirm dominance. Longing to soothe the internal void, rage again when the longing feels weak, then longing again when their own anger exhausts them. What makes this stage particularly intense is that they begin to realize there is no quick fix. Their usual manipulation techniques, guilt, charm, intimidation, victim playing can't work because they don't have access to you. This inability to influence you amplifies the emotional swings. They feel powerless, and powerlessness is intolerable for them. So they keep cycling internally, hoping the emotional storm will stabilize, hoping something external will shift, hoping you will eventually break the silence and rescue them from the discomfort they don't know how to manage. The sixth stage begins when the narcissist realizes your silence is lasting longer than they expected. And this triggers a shift from emotional reaction to strategic self. P. Protection. This is where they slip into image management mode, a performance designed to convince the world and themselves that they are unaffected, thriving, and completely unbothered. Their inner turmoil doesn't disappear, but they bury it beneath a crafted persona meant to hide the vulnerability they refuse to acknowledge. This stage is less about you and more about maintaining the illusion of superiority they depend on. They cannot let anyone, especially you, see that your absence disrupted their sense of control. So they begin curating a version of themselves that appears confident and in command. They might post pictures that look joyful or glamorous, share quotes about strength, or exaggerate how busy and fulfilled they are. Everything is engineered to send a message: I'm fine, I'm winning, I'm above this. But this isn't confidence, it's defense. Their public image becomes a shield that protects them from confronting the emptiness and frustration happening internally. During this stage, they also become highly sensitive to how others perceive the situation. They might preemptively tell mutual friends a distorted version of events, painting themselves as calm and mature while implying that you overreacted or drifted away. They do this to secure sympathy, maintain control of the narrative, and protect their reputation. The idea that someone might interpret your silence as a sign of their shortcomings feels intolerable. So they get ahead of it by shaping the story in their favor. Internally, though, the dissonance grows. They are performing stability, but they're not feeling it. They may obsess over whether you've seen their posts or heard about their supposed success, because your reaction still matters deeply to them. Their ego needs validation that they still have influence, even if indirect. The more effort they put into appearing indifferent, the more it reveals the truth: they're not indifferent at all. Your silence has created a void they can't fill, so they cover it with a mask, hoping no one notices the cracks. Image management becomes their refuge, their armor, and their distraction. But no matter how polished the performance looks, it doesn't quiet the underlying fear that your absence is real, intentional, and beyond their control. The seventh stage begins when the narcissist recognizes that your silence is not temporary, and that their emotional supply from you is no longer available. This is where their mind shifts into replacement mode, a survival instinct that kicks in when their original source of validation stops functioning. They don't process loss the way a healthy person does. Instead of reflecting or grieving, they move into a kind of emotional triage. They look around for who can fill the gap quickly, who is accessible, who is willing, and who can offer them the same attention, admiration, or emotional energy that you once provided. This isn't about connection. It's about convenience. They're not seeking a person. They're seeking a function, so they begin scanning their environment. Old flings, emotionally available friends, co-workers who admire them, social media acquaintances who respond eagerly, or even people they had dismissed in the past. Everyone becomes a potential source of supply, evaluated not for compatibility, but for usefulness. They may suddenly reach out to someone they previously ignored or act unusually charming toward people they overlooked. Their behavior can appear impulsive because they're not following emotion, they're following need. They require validation to stabilize their identity, and without you, they feel internally exposed. During this stage, they often rewrite the role you played in their life to justify replacing you. They convince themselves that you weren't that valuable, that you were too difficult, that the connection wasn't meaningful, or that the new supply is better. These mental distortions help them bypass accountability and avoid confronting the discomfort your absence triggered. It's easier for them to find a substitute than to face their own emotional emptiness, but the replacement process isn't as smooth as they try to pretend. Even as they search for someone new, they are haunted by the fact that you stepped away without being pushed or manipulated. The new supply won't feel as satisfying because it doesn't erase the reminder that someone rejected the narrative they tried to maintain. This internal conflict can make them more demanding, more controlling, or more performative with new people, trying to recreate the emotional dynamic they once had with you. The seventh stage is essentially a distraction strategy. They chase new attention, not because they've moved on, but because they're running from the truth your silence exposed. They don't replace you to forget you. They replace you so they don't have to face themselves. The eighth stage is the one the narcissist fears the most because it forces them into contact with the one truth they spend their entire life avoiding. They are not indispensable at this point. Your silence has lasted long enough that even their denial, their stories, their image management, and their new supply can't fully protect them from reality. They begin confronting the fear that they are becoming irrelevant to you. This realization doesn't arrive suddenly. It creeps up on them in quiet moments when the distractions fade, when the replacement supply doesn't give the same high, when their attempts to appear unaffected start feeling hollow. They begin sensing that they no longer occupy your emotional world. And that recognition destabilizes them at a deep psychological level. They start questioning whether you have healed, grown stronger, or moved on. The thought that you may have emotionally detached hits them harder than the silence itself. A narcissist's identity is built on the belief that people revolve around them, need them, and cannot fully escape them when evidence begins pointing to the opposite. They experience a kind of ego erosion. They may try to reassure themselves with old narratives, telling themselves you're just pretending or playing a game, but those reassurances feel thinner than before. The possibility that you genuinely no longer need them becomes a threat they cannot fully ignore. This is also the stage where they often revisit the past, not with remorse, but with discomfort. They might mentally scroll through past interactions looking for proof that you still cared more than they did. They crave confirmation that they mattered more deeply to you than you are now showing. It's a strange mixture of regret, pride, and insecurity, all swirling without resolution. They want to believe they were unforgettable. Yet your silence hints otherwise. The loss of control becomes symbolic. It represents a loss of identity, a loss of power, and a loss of the narrative they built around themselves. If they haven't already tried to reach out, this is usually when the temptation becomes strongest. They consider sending messages, creating excuses to contact you, or triggering situations that force interaction. But even these impulses are rooted in fear, not connection.